So as you can see from this title, this talk is about the environment, okay? We know that anytime you hear the word green, it's like, okay, that has to do with the environment. How did this talk come up, you know? Did this tree hugger, how did this tree hugger come up, in our midst? And you might be squinty-eyed about this. Well, I'm not a, well, yes and no. I'm a tree hugger. I've actually, literally, I have hugged a tree. I'll tell you a quick story. I was in high school. My friend and I were playing Frisbee, and all the guys were playing basketball. Most of the girls were watching the guys play basketball, and we said, this isn't right. This is not equitable. We need to move our Frisbee down to where the basketball is, so we might get some admiring females. And so we moved down, and my friend threw the Frisbee over my head, and I was just gracefully running after the Frisbee, looking over my shoulder, and wrapped myself around a big elm tree. That was the only time I hugged a tree. But usually not in the way you think. Anyway, this is an emotionally charged topic because there's the environmental agenda out there that's often crazy, is filled with often New Age as well as Darwinism, and it's got a lot of crazy ideas, and we often react against what they're doing in the environmental movement. And then on the other hand, you've got Christians that react the exact opposite. They just fall off of both sides of the boat. One saying, oh, it's Christians saying, oh, it's cool to be green. And so we'll just slap a Jesus sticker on it and go and just accept indiscriminately the green agenda, which is just wrong. And then you've got people reacting against it, saying, well, if an environmentalist likes it, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And what I hope to do in this talk is remedy the situation, because discussions on the environment tend to produce more heat than light. Getting back to Spike's talk, it's high entropy, lots of heat is produced. And I hope to fix that. We want a biblical understanding, a biblical theology of what God says about the creation. Now, usually we use the creation to talk apologetics. But in this talk, it's more about what's our responsibility to the creation. Notice I'm saying creation, not environment. I'm talking about the same thing. It's funny how you use a different word. It's like if you say environmental, you know, stay away from me. And then if I say creation, we get nice warm fuzzies. I like creation. God made it. It's the same thing. The creation and the environment. So let's come up with a biblical theology of this. It's more than just for apologetics. Now, I wanted to first talk about why some, and maybe even many Christians, avoid this thorny topic. And as I had alluded to already, many Christians don't want to have anything to do with environmentalists. They reject their ideology, and rightly so. And it should be rejected, nor do they want to bother making distinctions between baby and bathwater. It's like, okay, environmentalists, get out of here. Well, the environmentalists like a lot of things that are worthy of liking. They like the environment, okay? Now, they don't give God glory, they don't give God credit, but they like it. And so we have to make distinctions between the bathwater of their ideology, their bathwater of their crazy and unbiblical agenda, and the baby, which is God's creation and God's command that we rule over it and exercise dominion over it. Secondly, many Christians have little exposure to the glories and wonders of creation. They're surrounded, they're sort of too indoor. Flat floors, filtered air, fluorescent lighting, surrounded by techno gadgets. They just don't get out. And so what you don't know, you don't appreciate, and they may watch HD, high-resolution BBC programs about nature, and they'll think that's all cool and everything, but they just don't immerse themselves in the glories of creation. And I think more Christians should do that, but always keeping in mind that God is the artist, God is the engineer for all of it. Thirdly, they receive little, if any, biblical teaching on our responsibility to exercise godly dominion, and that's what I hope to do. You might be wondering why I'm saying dominion. Why am I not saying something that's a lot more popular in Christian circles, especially ones that want to say, hey, yeah, we do need to take care of the environment. What are the big words that Christians use? What's one of them? Stewardship, exactly. Why did I use stewardship? Nothing wrong with stewardship. Christian stewardship, creation stewardship, or another one is creation care. These are nice words. They're warm, fuzzy words. But the Bible doesn't use, nothing wrong with stewardship, again, but I'm not going to crawl down somebody's throat if they say Christian stewardship. However, it's not in the Bible, okay? The Genesis uses, it's Hebrew. Genesis doesn't use a word that's translated best as stewardship, it's translated best as dominion, okay? And I'll make the distinctions, and I think good stewardship will look a lot like good dominion, or wise dominion, but I will make some distinctions. Okay, so I'm going to divide my talk up into biblical reasons for wise dominion, then practical reasons for wise dominion, and then end with problems and solutions. Now, I'm not going to get into the deep weeds and the nitty-gritty of all of the different environmental problems and everything. I'm going to speak in biblical principles because the subject is too vast to get into all the details. Biblical principles are what we want here. Okay, so biblical reasons for wise dominion. Now, in parentheses, I have which includes biodiversity conservation. Now, it's not only biodiversity conservation, but it definitely needs to include that. And I think it's sort of a primary or sort of, it's probably the primary objective in wise dominion. Everything else follows from that. Because in order to exercise wise dominion, you have to maintain the inventory that God created. If we just indiscriminately throw species under the bus in extinction, extirpation, extinction, and just whoops, there goes another one. We can't exercise wise dominion over something that's extinct. I mean, maybe Dr. McLean may disagree. I suppose you can exercise dominion over fossils, but you can't exercise dominion over dinosaurs. They're dead, or at least we think. So this first reason is very, very foundational, and I really want you to, this is a take-home. If you forget everything else, this one you need to remember. God created the various kinds of plants and animals through the creation week, and in Genesis 1:31, he said, It was very good. First he says good, 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 and then he ends with very good. And this is super important because the various kinds that God created do not have to justify their existence by being practical to us. Most of the time, we evaluate creatures, plants and animals, as what's their utilitarian value? Can I eat it? Can I make something of commercial value from this? Can I fill my freezer with it? Does it have something practical? Well, when God said it was very good, that was his self-evaluation of creation. It doesn't need any other charter for existence. You say, but why did he make a pangolin? The cuts of meat on it aren't that good. Why did he make most of creation isn't, I mean, from our vantage point right now, most of creation doesn't have a whole lot of clear entrepreneurial value, okay? There's only a handful of animals and a handful of crops, maybe several, I mean, a lot more. But compared to the diversity out there, it's really a tiny fraction that we actually use, okay? In other words, they don't have to earn the right to exist by being practical to us in some way. That is what Francis Schaeffer calls egoism. Egoism is a doctrine that individual self-interest is the actual motive of all conscious action. If I'm going to preserve it, it better earn the right to exist. I need to find it valuable. Okay, so that's the first and foundational reason for conservation and wise dominion. Second, and I think we all like this one, food. Everything we eat is from living things. It's usually dead when we eat it, but it was alive at one time. We don't eat rocks. We have to eat either plants or animals. It's our life support. If we didn't have food, again, going back to Spike's talk, we need that chemical energy in all of the proteins and the carbohydrates and the lipids. And we break those bonds and we harness the energy in those bonds and so on. And we make ATP and then we can move. It's great. So we need it. If we didn't have food, we'd fall down and fall apart. Plants were given to us for food in Genesis 1:29 and 30. And then animals were given to us after the flood. So Genesis 9:3, God opened up the menu and said, okay, you can now eat animals. I like prime rib, that's why I put it up there. And also both were used for sacrifices. So that was definitely a biblical reason for food. We see that all through the Bible. Another biblical reason for dominion is God commanded us to care for it. This is what theologians call the dominion mandate. Okay, and it's encapsulated in Genesis 1:28, and God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. I broke it into bullet points. It's interesting here. Be fruitful and multiply. So that means fill the world up with us. And fill the earth and subdue it. And have, look at this, dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So the dominion mandate, we normally think of dominion mandate as just ruling over the universe. But if you really distill it down into what it's actually in the text, dominion mandate is global wildlife management. Well, not just wildlife management, it's global wildlife and domestic life management. Every kind of oversight and management of living creatures. And in this case, it's just animals. But of course, we have to exercise dominion over the plants because a lot of animals eat plants. And so we have to make sure that there's all the right fodder for the animals that we're taking care of. So, going back to what I had mentioned before, why didn't you say stewardship? It's such a nice sounding word. Why not creation care? What is dominion? Well, again, it's the Hebrew word of rada. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. Is Jeremy here to correct me? Rada is the word, and it is a strong word. It's not... Dominion implies ownership. Stewardship doesn't. When your rich uncle gives you, or says, here, you can use my car for the summer, and you go, oh goody, and he says, this is my car, yes, you may drive it all summer, he doesn't own it. He has to take good care of it and drive it around, but always knowing that his uncle's shadow is hanging over him saying, this is my car, this is my car, this is my car, make sure you take good care of it. God, this is different. God sort of signed the title over to us. You say, but God owns it ultimately. Yes, I know that. There's lots of verses that say God owns God owns everything. So in one sense, he's the ultimate owner. But in Psalm 115:16, did I have my Bible? Oop, I left my Bible down here. In Psalm 115:16, the heavens are the Lord's heavens, but the earth he has given to the children of man. He's given it. That doesn't mean we aren't accountable to God. All things, I mean, there's no such thing as completely being unaccountable for. Even if you own a car, even if it's your car, you're still accountable to the state patrol. You're still accountable. I'm sorry, officer. I can go 100 miles an hour because it's my car. No. You own the car, but you're still accountable to the law of the land. And God gave it to us. So we do own it. And we are accountable when we misuse it and we exercise very poor dominion. Now, I want to draw a parallel here. God told man to fill, subdue, and rule over the earth and life. Genesis 1:28. And so we've been given dominion over the creation to care for and enhance it under the lordship of Jesus Christ. That's a big, tall order. And in order to exercise wise dominion, you have to know your charges. You have to know, like if you get a pet, first thing you do, especially if it's a weird exotic pet, you get the book, what does it eat, what are the requirements in the aquarium or the terrarium, and you have to make sure that you're meeting all of its needs, or you've just spent money and then the animal dies. You've got to know what you're ruling over. If we don't know what we're ruling over, it's very easy for things to fall apart, even inadvertently. Like there was no malice aforethought. We just were doing our thing, but we weren't learning the creatures. We weren't learning. I mean, think about the Old Testament, all of the shepherds. Israelite had a very strong heritage of, the Israelites were shepherds. That was their main occupation when they went into Egypt. And so you see all this imagery of shepherds and keeping the sheep and taking care of the sheep and giving it good, leading it to good pasture, leading it to clean water, taking care of the sheep. This is good dominion. We need to know the requirements of the creatures that we are overseeing. I wanted to make dominion less harsh, we need to define it in light of what Scripture means by dominion. We normally think of dominion as sort of an oppressive, exploitive type word, but Christ is head of the church. The analogy is a marriage analogy in Ephesians 5. Christ is the head of the church. Is Christ oppressive? Is Christ oppressive and exploitive? No. He is head. It's dominion in the strongest sense of the word, and yet it is wonderful. It's sacrificial. It's loving. And that's why the charge for the husbands, okay, don't get too big for your britches, bub, because yes, you have dominion, you are head of your wife, but as, not head of your wife, blank check, but as Christ is head of the church, which is self-sacrificial and it is not oppressive. And so I think in a similar way, mankind is to be head over creation. It's not just stewardship. It'll look like stewardship, but we own it. Okay, fourth, we are to maintain the created diversity. And we see this through Noah's ark. God commanded Noah to build an ark. And it's an interesting little phrase here at the end of 7, 2, and 3. It says, why build an ark? To keep the various kinds alive upon the earth. You might say, well, you know, when I talked about my talk this morning, it's like, yes, it was very good, but he proclaimed it all very good before the fall. Now there's all sorts of nasty PPPs, remember? Predators, parasites, pathogens. The ark is a really good time to weed some out, you know? No, we don't like your kind. You're fallen. You're a predator. You're a, no, it was after the fall, and still God wanted all of the diversity preserved. What's very interesting is that the flood was the biggest act of judgment in the history of the world, and the ark was the biggest biodiversity conservation act in the history of the world. So you're thinking, all these humans were buried in ridiculous amounts of sediment. And lots of little critters come on board. God wants to keep the inventory that he made. He could have made the boat a lot smaller and said, okay, cows, good, sheep, good, anything practical to us that's of agricultural importance, good, corn, wheat, rice, beans, and we could have just made the boat a lot smaller. But he wanted that diversity maintained. 5, several biblical passages, maybe many, concern the proper care of beasts. I haven't done an exhaustive study, but here's one. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and ignore them. You shall help him to lift them up again. We see care for animals. And again, I mentioned the shepherd vocation of the children of Israel. Lots of verses there. Genesis, let's look at Proverbs here. Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast. So those of you who have a pet that's languishing in squalor, heed this verse. Not getting the right, the right environment. We should take care of our pets. And if you have a bigger authority over bigger groups of animals, then your responsibility increases. Genesis 33:13 refers to when Jacob meets Esau, and Jacob's super worried about Esau wanting revenge, and it turns out they, got hugs all around. That was, but he was talking to Esau, and he says, I'm just going to go at the speed of the herds, because if I drive them too hard, the whole flock will die. So Jacob is concerned for the flock and the well-being of the flock. So, and there's many other verses, but that's just a couple. 6, nature declares the glory and wisdom of God. Job, this is great. Job 39 through 41. What's interesting about this is that his friends are like, Job, you must be wicked. You must be in sin, because all this bad stuff shouldn't have happened to you if you weren't in sin. And then Job's trying to justify himself. No, I'm good. I don't know what's going on. And so when God comes in, we're sort of expecting God to just give everybody a deep philosophical explanation, a theodicy of why bad things can happen to good people. But what does God do? He just starts talking about animals. Just talking about his wonderful beasts. He doesn't give a philosophical justification. He just says, have you seen the wild goats? Oh, and by the way, Job, do you know their gestational period? Do you know about the wild donkey? You know about the horse, the ostrich, that just can outdo a horse in a foot race? And he talks about ostriches and hawks and their sight, and he just starts naming animals and starts talking about how wonderful these animals are. And then he ends with the grand finale of Behemoth and Leviathan. And he just showcases those. Why? One of the reasons why bad things happen to good people is I am God. And I made those creatures. And we're going, can't you give us a little more? And he's just talking about his creatures. And that's great. Solomon's wisdom included natural history of plants and animals. 1 Kings 4:33 through 34. I love this verse because Solomon was the first biology teacher. It says, he described plant life from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also, that's the cedar of Lebanon. That's a hyssop. And he also taught about animals. Well, that's a hyrax. And birds. That's one of my favorites, wood duck. Reptiles, it's one of my favorite. It's North American, sorry. But I did pick a Middle Eastern fish. And that's the St. Peter's fish of Galilee, which is a tilapia. So, men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom. So, learning about natural history of plants and animals is wisdom. It makes sense because in wisdom, he's made them all. And if you're an engineer, you study good engineering, right? If you are an aspiring engineer, you look at who are the best engineers for whatever you like, and you study what they did. If we want to see God's wisdom and majesty, we study what he made, okay? There's wisdom there. Now, I'll segue into practical reasons. Some of these overlap with biblical reasons, but it says in Proverbs, is it 25:2? It's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it's the glory of kings to search out a matter. So he didn't tell us all. And so through scientific investigation, we've discovered other reasons for wise dominion. Some of these overlap: food, clothing, shelter, talks about that in the Bible. Food and then clothing. Cotton is plants. Linen is plants. Wool is animal product. And leather, animal product. So clothing, shelter, wood, all of these conifer trees and other trees for wood and building furniture and shelter and homes and wood frame houses. But one that's not mentioned in the Bible, but we discovered it later through our understanding of chemistry, is oxygen. All of the oxygen that we breathe is from this huge army of plants and algae. 50% of all the oxygen we breathe is released from the algae of the oceans, the diatoms and other dinoflagellates and other phytoplankton. The phytoplankton, 50% of all the oxygen we breathe, and then the other 50% are land plants. And then pharmaceuticals. Most of our medicines were originally plant-derived. Aspirin from willow bark. My host, Ron, was talking about his son-in-law working in medicinal herbs, and elderberry is immune booster. Elderberry extract, juice. There's sedatives, there's painkillers, there's expectorants, there's so many antioxidants, lots of different medicinal plants, and some from animals as well. The picture I have there is a petri dish with fungi, and we all know, well, maybe we don't all know, but antibiotics discovered back in 1928, a mold contaminant on a petri dish. In England, there was a nice little halo. This is a mold contaminant, petri dish, zone of inhibition. This is bacterial growth. Discovered antibiotics. Produced by a mold called penicillium. And they named the chemical penicillin from the mold's genus, okay? And that just revolutionized. That was just from mold growing on a petri dish. Oh my goodness, just in time for World War II. It saved a lot of lives. 1928, they figured out how to mass produce it in about a decade, and it was just right on time for World War II. And then natural recycling of organic matter and nutrients, all the biogeochemical cycles, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle. And there's this whole army of microbes in the soil and little tiny animals that recycle these nutrients and compost things, bacteria, fungi. Lots of little bacteria that convert atmospheric nitrogen into usable nitrogen for plants. Without these bacteria, which many of us don't even know exist, without those bacteria, life would stop as we know it. God knows what he's doing. And he made all of these things, both popular creatures and unpopular creatures, or creatures we don't even know, that are keeping things going. This is just wonderful. Now, getting on, that's two practical headings. The third one is high diversity is just flat good. High diversity increases the resiliency of ecosystems. If you have an ecosystem with low species richness, if it gets perturbed by a fire or some other environmental catastrophe, those low species ecosystems don't bounce back as fast. But when there's a high diversity in the ecosystem, then they do. They are more resilient and they recover more quickly. High diversity is just more aesthetically pleasing. In other words, it's more beautiful. I mean, some of us might go, I would rather see a nice big field of just one monoculture of grass. Why? Because we want to play football on it. That's fine. But aesthetically, a monoculture of grass isn't as pretty as going to Costa Rica and going into the rainforest and seeing all the diversity of birds and reptiles and plants and flowers and epiphytes and all of these things. It's just prettier. It also stimulates man's curiosity and motivates both scientific research and nature-loving hobbies. I like reptiles and amphibians. I like birds too. I like mammals, but God just made me like scaly, creepy, crawly stuff more than other things. But other people rather like mammals, and some like microbes. They just like bacteria, and they go into microbiology, and that's the thing that winds their clock. God just made all of this diversity, and this is, I don't think it's the main reason he made the diversity, but it's a smorgasbord for would-be biologists or would-be whatever. I mean, he says, oh, birds don't wind your clock? Well, how about some scaly things? And so all the bases are covered. Stimulates curiosity. And there's a lot more biologists out there than would be if God only made one kind of thing. Biomonitoring. Many biological communities are indicators of habitat health. This is just a nice practical application. They can tell the health of a stream by sampling the cobblestones underneath and pulling up and seeing what are the insects down there. And there's a lot of aquatic insects, stoneflies, mayflies, dipterans, all sorts of trichoptera. And by looking at the community structure, they can say, this stream is healthy. It is clean, it's oxygenated, there's no pollution in it. But as the pollution increases, the community of insects changes, and they go, okay, we're missing stoneflies. Stoneflies are a super good indicator of pollution, because when it's starting to get polluted, stoneflies disappear. They die. They're very sensitive to pollutants. So stoneflies are a great indicator of a healthy stream. It's just one practical example. Outdoor recreation. Oh, you can't put a price tag on that. There's ginormous, I'll just use that word, ginormous benefits. Personal, emotional, social, economic reasons. Hunting, fishing, camping, hiking. We don't realize how important those things are until it's taken away. Or let's say we're used to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, and then we wind up in some urban city center where we hardly can get out. We go nuts. Some people that are in that city center and that's all they're used to, they don't know any different. But if we've experienced the glory of God out there and then we get stuck in the city, we just, I gotta get out there for rejuvenation, recreation. That's a good word. It recreates us when we see and enjoy the outdoors. I threw in biomimicry because biomimicry is a wonderful discipline that's emerging from engineers that see all sorts of cool stuff in nature and go, I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to be entrepreneurial, and I'm going to do an invention, but I'm going to copy something in nature. There's lots of examples. Google biomimicry examples, and you'll get top 10 ones. I threw up one here as a cocklebur. Some Swiss scientist saw the cocklebur getting stuck in his clothing, and he thought, this is a good fastener. And so he imitated the cocklebur and invented Velcro. That's how Velcro was invented, by imitating the cocklebur. That's a good case, that's a good example of biomimicry. But there are many, many more, and they keep working. And the nice thing about it is God didn't patent any of it. We'd be in trouble if he did. So God's lavish and generous, and say, all this creation, you can copy it all you want and make a lot of money if you want. All right. So rather than going through I'm just listing a short list. There's a lot more, but there are many environmental problems. Habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation. Some of that, if not done right, can lead to extirpation or extinction. Extirpation, if those of you don't know the word, extirpation just means local extinction. So it might not be worldwide extinct, but it's extinct where you're at. And so often habitat destruction is not something that there's a malice aforethought. Whoa, I'm going to destroy nature and kill all sorts of animals. We just do our thing and things get inadvertently thrown under the bus. Wanton slaughter and overharvest, that can also lead to extirpation and extinction. That's not so much a problem now, at least in this country, because of all sorts of, Endangered Species Act and things like that. But back in the 1800s, there was a lot of money to be had with feather trade, fur trade. We almost wiped out the sea otter. We almost wiped out the bison. We almost wiped out the snowy egret. We did knock off the passenger pigeon. We did knock off the Carolina parakeet. Why? Because of fashion. Feathers in ladies' hats for the birds, and then furs. And there was just no thinking ahead saying, is this sustainable? Oh, this might go extinct. And happily, some things didn't go extinct, and we've brought them back from the brink. Pollution in water, air and water. You've heard of the garbage patch in the ocean. These are problems. Usually environmentalists make them bigger problems than they actually are. But just because they've exaggerated the problem doesn't mean that there isn't one. And actually, everybody can buy into air and water. Nobody, environmentalist or not, likes dirty air. Nobody wants to drink dirty water. Everybody wants clean air. Everybody wants clean water. So we can all sort of agree, yeah, let's clean up our air. Let's clean up our water. Waste management, hazardous, non-hazardous. We want to live in a clean place. Disease, we want to make sure disease is controlled and starvation is prevented. Again, the last two, I put question mark because those aren't problems. But they are often put at the top of the list as the biggest hair on fire problems that we have. So those are just some environmental problems, but I want to jump back. Rather than address them at a superficial level, I want to address them at a much deeper theological level. What is the real problem? Not to oversimplify, but the real problem that causes, I will venture to say, that all environmental problems, real or imagined, are the result of sin. You say, how so? Well, as you read the Old Testament over and over and over again, you see that sin against God is the foundational problem on every front. Now, if you look at, especially in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, the little subheadings, there's little subheadings that say, blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. Read those two chapters. I don't have time to go into them, but read those two chapters, and you'll notice that all of these blessings and curses, most of them are environmental. Most of them are environmental. You might say, but that's how God did it in the Old Covenant. That was just Old Covenant stuff. That God deals with his people differently now. Well, not so fast. In 1 Corinthians 10, 6 and 11, it's talking about, let's see, 1 Corinthians, it says, now these things, it's talking about the Israelites in the desert, and Paul's talking to the Corinthians saying, now these things, all these things where the Israelites were wiped out, 23,000 were wiped out in a single day. Don't put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. Environmental problem. Don't grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. And it says in verse 6 earlier, it says, these took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. These are in the Old Testament, but Paul's using them as examples. It says in 11, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. God knows where to hit us, where it hurts. And the thing that hurts is, okay, you want to keep on rebelling against me, tossing me behind your back, forgetting me, forgetting my law, I'll pull the plug. And you know where I'm going to pull the plug? The environment. In fact, you see it all through the Old Testament, but it really puts it nicely in Ezekiel 14:21. I'll read it to you. Ezekiel 14:21. For thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 disastrous acts of judgment. So he sort of sums up a lot of what God uses in the Old Testament for judgment. 4 disastrous acts of judgment are sword, famine, wild beasts, and pestilence. Now, out of those 4, 3 of them are environmental problems, okay? 1 is political, the sword, bringing in a nation, Babylon, Assyria. But famine is an environmental problem. Wild beasts, environmental problem. Pestilence, environmental problem. So, getting back to the verse I had said in my last talk, I want to mention that. Who is in control of our well-being or calamity? Isaiah 45:7, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. Again, those calamities could be environmental problems. But we don't think in those terms anymore. We're often materialistic. We say, no, it's not our sin. It's our carbon footprint. No. We're more worried about our carbon footprint than all the abortion carnage. Now, to a secularist, abortion has nothing to do with the environment, but in God's calculus, it does. Because even though sinning against unborn children isn't a sin directly at the biodiversity, God hates it. And when God hates something, He can pull the plug environmentally. It's amazing God's mercy on this country. We are a highly blessed country in terms of natural resources. And we deserve far worse than what the most spittle-flecked environmentalist thinks we have coming. We deserve far worse than what he thinks we have coming. Another verse, is a trumpet blown in a city and the people are not afraid? This is a rhetorical question. The answer is no. When a trumpet's blown, it's a warning. You know, people, aren't they not afraid? Yes. And the people not afraid? Oh, they're afraid. Does a disaster come to a city unless the Lord has done it? No. So again, it's saying God is in control of these. Now, it really says it well, and I think it pulls it all together here in Hosea. The word of the Lord, hear the word of the Lord, Hosea 4:1-3. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. So there's your laundry list of sins against God, the Israelites, against God. And then it says in verse 3, because of this, the land mourns. And all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea are dying. Environmental catastrophe. Why? Because of adultery. Because of lying. Because of murder. Because of lawlessness. It's just like, it really says it well there, but it says it in Jeremiah, it says it in Ezekiel, it says it all through the major and minor prophets. So what is, if sin is the problem, and we can trace environmental problems back to sin, what's the solution? Reducing our carbon footprint? Recycling? Well, I'm not saying that all these things are horrible. I'm just saying we need to get to the root of the problem. We don't want to put a Band-Aid on gangrene. We need to get to the root. And the real solution is the gospel, because the gospel is the solution to sin. When we are reconciled to God, and this might not seem intuitively obvious, but when we're reconciled to God, we begin to love our neighbor. And when you love your neighbor, you're going to do right by him. Give him clean air, clean water, and a beautiful place to live. You love your neighbor and the creation. We begin to practice godly dominion of our own accord rather than having it imposed on us by a coercive government. We want it to be grassroots, coming up from within because we love God. Not because the government says, reduce your carbon footprint and we are going to do a levy to tax so we can get wind turbines or do this or do that. It's like it's imposed on us rather than loving God and loving His creation. Francis Schaeffer claims that the gospel produces substantial healing in his book, Pollution and the Death of Man, in many broken relationships. The primary one is God and man. That's what we normally focus on the gospel. We are reconciled to God. But when we're reconciled to God and other people are reconciled to God, then we're reconciled to each other. And man and nature, there's all this hostility there, but that will be reconciled. I've already read the passage in Isaiah, nature and nature, you know, the whole predators, parasites, and pathogens. There's enmity within nature. So God, and Francis Schaeffer is saying, the gospel restores not just our relationship with God, but all these other broken relationships are healed substantially in the here and now. It's not overnight. It's kind of like sanctification. It's progressive. And again, the Isaiah passage, you can read that. It's Isaiah 11, 6 through 9. I'm not saying that activism and environmental education or running for political office or pass environmental legislation, all those things have their place. But the ultimate solution is reconciling God to man, man to God, through the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. So how should we now then live? Proclaim, this is the last slide. Proclaim the gospel in word and deed, not just in your little private gospel in your heart. My pastor and my brother said, good theology flows out your fingertips. Not like lightning bolts from the emperor, but it flows out your fingertips. What we believe here shouldn't just stay here. It should transform our lives, how we love our neighbor, how we love our enemy, how we love our wife, how we love our husband, how we love our kids. It's transformative. It's culture changing. It should come out. And so, on a practical note, how can we start facilitating this substantial healing? Increase your knowledge of natural history. You don't have to be a biologist. Cultivate a deeper appreciation of nature. And a lot of non-biologists do. They like to bird. They like to garden. They like to go hiking. Gardening, hunting, fishing, hiking, camping, birding, herping. Herping is a word that's like birding, but with reptiles and amphibians. It's a good thing. See me afterwards if you want to check into that. Visit zoos, botanical gardens, arboretums, parks, things, and don't go to there just saying, oh, this is a nice outdoorsy thing to do. Do it because God made it. Do it because you love God and you want to appreciate his artwork. And whatever the secularists who are running the show are saying, this is, they'll say their narrative, but you go and say, this is God's stuff. And I'm just appreciating it. Join nature societies, again, that's careful, whose mission is biblically sound or at least isn't contrary to biblical principles. So if it's all like you have to get on the bandwagon against climate change and everything, then it'd probably be better to start your own nature club. And of course, watch nature documentaries, especially Riot in the Dance. So, I'm a little over, and I will just end there, but that's just my advertising slide. My textbook, I think I have one more different shade of green book out on the counter. And then we've got Riot in the Dance Earth and Riot in the Dance Water. I don't have them here, but you can order Riot in the Dance Water from Classical Conversations, their website, and then Earth you can get on Amazon. But anyway, thank you.